The darkness whispers, and within its hushed tones we often find the echo of time. Timepieces, those keepers of moments, can sometimes become vessels of something far more sinister. Tonight we delve into 3 tales of such timepieces. Get ready, because tonight we explore the clock that strikes at random haunted timepieces horror story. The old house stood on a windswept hill, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale moonlight that filtered through the grime, illuminating a single piece of furniture that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, a grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The old woman who lived there, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, always kept the clock wound, a ritual she performed with a reverence bordering on fear. The clock had been in her family for generations, passed down with the same warning: never let it wind down and never ever be near it when the clock strikes 12. One night a storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the windows like 1,000 tiny claws. Mrs. Vance, her hands gnarled with age, struggled to wind the clock, her heart pounding in her chest. It was almost midnight. As the clock ticked closer to the witching hour, the storm outside intensified and the old house creaked and groaned under the onslaught. Mrs. Vance, her breath catching in her throat, watched in horror as the minute hand on the clock clicked past the 11, inching closer and closer to the 12. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in a blinding flash. The grandfather clock shuddered, its pendulum freezing for a heartbeat before resuming its relentless swing. It was midnight. The clock began to chime, each resonant bong echoing through the silent house. But these were not the normal, deep chimes of the clock. These were different, higher-pitched, laced with an unearthly quality that sent shivers down Mrs. Vance's spine. With each chime, a cold wind seemed to whip through the room, swirling the dust into miniature tornadoes. Mrs. Vance, her eyes wide with terror, could only watch as a figure began to coalesce beside the clock. It was the figure of a man, tall and gaunt, his features hidden in the shadows. He was dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to another century, and his eyes, visible even in the darkness, glowed with a cold, malevolent light. Mrs. Vance, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as the figure turned towards her, a chilling smile spreading across its spectral face. The chimes stopped, and an eerie silence descended upon the room, broken only by the frantic beating of Mrs. Vance's heart. The figure took a step towards her, reaching out with a hand that seemed to shimmer and waver in the air. Mrs. Vance screamed, a shrill, desperate sound that was swallowed by the thick silence of the house. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling in the sunlight. But inside the old house on the hill, there was no sign of life. The grandfather clock stood silent, its pendulum still, its hands frozen at a few minutes past midnight. Of Mrs. Vance, there was no sign. The only evidence that she had ever existed was a single withered rose lying on the floor beside the clock, its petals as pale and lifeless as the face of a corpse. In a quaint antique shop nestled on a forgotten side street stood a grandfather clock unlike any other. Its dark, ornately carved wood seemed to absorb the light, and its pendulum swung with an almost imperceptible slowness, as if time itself moved differently around it. This was no ordinary timepiece. This was a clock steeped in whispers of misfortune, a beacon of bad luck known only as the cursed grandfather clock. The shop owner, a man with eyes as old as the antiques he peddled, warned every potential buyer about the clock's sinister reputation. He spoke in hushed tones of its origins, a tale passed down through generations of antique dealers. The clock, he explained, was said to have belonged to a wealthy merchant who, consumed by greed, had made a pact with a dark entity for eternal prosperity. The clock, a symbol of that unholy deal, became cursed, bringing ruin and despair to anyone who dared to possess it. Despite the chilling tales, there were always those who scoffed at superstition, who believed themselves immune to the whispers of the past. One such man, a young and ambitious stockbroker named Edward, purchased the clock, dismissing the shopkeeper's warnings as mere folklore. Edward, blinded by his own ambition, placed the grandfather clock in his opulent study, its imposing presence a constant reminder of his aspirations. At first, fortune seemed to favor him. His investments soared, his wealth multiplied, and the clock, with its steady measured ticks, became a symbol of his success. But as the weeks turned into months, a subtle shift occurred. Edward's luck began to sour. His investments faltered, his fortunes dwindled, and the once reliable tick of the grandfather clock began to grate on his nerves, its rhythmic swing a constant reminder of his impending ruin. Sleep became a distant memory as Edward, haunted by his dwindling fortune, paced his study, the grandfather clock looming over him like a malevolent judge. Its every tick seemed to echo his losses, its every chime a harbinger of further despair. As Edward's life spiraled downwards, so too did his sanity. He became withdrawn, paranoid, seeing enemies in the shadows, hearing whispers in the chime of the cursed clock. His once sharp mind, now clouded by despair, could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmares that plagued his waking hours. One stormy night, as lightning flashed and thunder shook the very foundations of his mansion, Edward reached his breaking point. Driven to the brink by the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock, he grabbed a heavy candlestick and with a primal scream smashed it against the clock's ornate face. The clock shuddered, its pendulum swinging wildly as if in its death throes. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and a cold wind seemed to sweep through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging the study into darkness. Edward, his chest heaving, stood in the darkness, the shattered remnants of the clock at his feet, a sense of dread washing over him. When the storm subsided and dawn broke, Edward was gone. The only sound that broke the eerie silence was the steady, rhythmic tick, tick, tick of a grandfather clock, its face miraculously restored, its pendulum swinging with an almost hypnotic slowness. Chapter 3. The Phantom Pocket Watch. In the dimly lit back alleys of London, where shadows danced with the fog and whispers of forgotten tragedies lingered in the air, there existed a legend whispered amongst those who navigated the city's underbelly. It wasn't a place nor a person, but an object, a harbinger of doom that appeared only to those who were living their final moments. They called it the Phantom Pocket Watch. No one knew where it came from, nor who might have owned it first. It was simply there, a spectre in the fog, materializing in the hands of the doomed, like a final, chilling memento mori. It was an elegant thing, crafted from tarnished silver, its face cracked and obscured by a web of fine lines, the hands forever frozen at the stroke of midnight. Some said it was a spirit itself, a collector of souls, its presence heralding the moment when the veil between life and death thinned. Others believed it was a cursed artifact, a conduit to some netherworld, its touch capable of stealing the very life force of those who dared to hold it. One foggy evening, a young woman named Amelia found herself lost in the labyrinthine alleyways. She had been separated from her companions, and fear, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. The fog seemed to press in on her, suffocating, disorienting. As she stumbled through the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest, she felt something brush against her hand. Startled, she looked down and saw it, a pocket watch, lying in the palm of her hand, cold and heavy. It was the Phantom Pocket Watch. Amelia, her breath catching in her throat, tried to drop the watch, but it clung to her hand as if glued there. Panic surged through her, a wave of icy dread washing over her. Suddenly the fog around her swirled and thickened, taking on an almost solid form. Shapes began to emerge from the swirling mist, grotesque figures with eyes that glowed with an eerie internal light. They reached for Amelia, their cold skeletal fingers brushing against her skin. Amelia screamed, a desperate primal sound that was swallowed by the fog. She thrashed, trying to break free from the grip of the ghostly figures, but their grasp was relentless. The last thing Amelia saw before the fog swallowed her whole was the Phantom Pocket Watch, its silver surface gleaming dully in the gloom, its hands frozen at the stroke of midnight. Time. It ticks on, an indifferent observer to the tales we tell and the lives we lead. Haunted timepieces, those vessels of moments frozen in fear, serve as chilling reminders that the past is never truly gone. And the next time you hear a clock chime, listen closely. You never know what whispers might be hidden within its echoes.